Brother Alaric seized Novice Edda's wrist as she inhaled a single syllable and clamped his other hand over her mouth. Fear held Edda's throat in a hard, bright way. She felt it as a taste, metallic and immediate, and it pushed her fingers to the band at the base of her jaw. Brother Alaric, low and quick. Do you forget yourself? The corridor smelled of sweat and tallow. The torchlight hit the bruise under Alaric's knuckles. The opening violence made the problem explicit within moments. Speaking the name was forbidden, and the penalty was immediate humiliation and isolation. Fear drove Edda's next choices, fear that the name, once voiced, might invite a punishment she could not imagine. Within seconds a small cluster of monks pressed against the stone arches, their robes whispering on the flagstones, watching as Alaric dragged Edda toward the chapter house. The immediate conflict was clear. A transgression had nearly occurred, and the order's mechanism for enforcing silence would act. Edda tightened her jaw and, with one shoulder, shoved Alaric's grip enough to wrench a breath through her nose. Brother Alaric, she managed to whisper between teeth. I did not. Alaric cut her with a look that did not allow explanation. He pushed her forward instead of responding. The corridor swallowed her protests under its vaulted hush. By the time they reached the chapter house, the assembly had already gathered, men and boys forming concentric ranks under the low roof. The attending monks turned their heads in the same slow, measured motion. Their faces were pale in the candlelight, every eye trained like a witness. Brother Alaric placed Edda before the bench meant for penitent novices and, with a single motion, pulled his hood over his head and began to speak the order's doctrine. We do not name. Alaric, voice steady and low. We do not give form to what must remain bound. Naming draws attention. Naming breaks the ward. His hands were flat on the wooden table. One finger tapped a knot in the grain as if tracing a list. The assembly listened. Edda felt each word as a pressure on her skin. Edda's fear shifted within that assembly. Initial panic became a sharper edge of shame. She had tested the boundary, she had almost spoken, and now the community would answer with ritual discipline. She kept her head down as Alaric pronounced a penance that set her apart. Extra vigils, silent labor, a thin rope at her throat during the day to remind her of restraint. You will wear the rope for 3 fortnights. Alaric concluded. You will repair the bindings in the infirmary under supervision. You will not speak the name beneath any roof of this house. The attending monks murmured assent. Some faces were blank. Others tightened in private relief. After the assembly, when the chapter house emptied, the occult researcher sat in the archive chamber with a scorched folio between his fingers. He had a brass magnifier and a notebook that smelled of leather and starch. The researcher turned the page with the careful gesture of someone who knew that a single tear could lose a line of meaning. He had come here to follow traces of a mission, not to witness a novice's punishment, but the event at dusk threaded into his work. The researcher recorded the name of the folio and the location of the burn marks with short, deliberate notes. He found a folio where a scribe had scraped ink clean in a deliberate oval, the vellum chewed by heat and edged with soot. Margin notes written in a different hand argued that the absence was deliberate, a safeguard not of piety but of policy. The researcher's curiosity shifted into a practical hypothesis. A mission used as a social instrument. He copied 2 marginal lines and underlined them. Edda returned to her cell with rope at her throat and hands that would not stop trembling. Her small journal sat hidden beneath a worn tunic. She had slipped the scrap from the archive into her chest earlier that day, the piece of parchment carrying a single erased line. That night she sat on the straw pallet and, in the smaller privacy of the cell, drew a quill across a scrap and wrote the letter forms she had seen on the hidden folio. Her hand shook as she formed the first character. Fear tightened into a different shape now, curiosity edged with a guilty hunger to know what made the order insist on silence. Edda's first emotional shift, curiosity to dread, arrived when the candle guttered as she pressed the nib to paper. The flame strangled and shrank until only a ring of black remained. She choked on a pressure that pushed down her throat and had to sit forward to catch her breath. She slapped a palm to her windpipe and felt a cold weight collect there, a sudden constriction she could not explain. She tore the page free and shoved it beneath the mattress. It did that. She mouthed to the empty cell, testing sound inside her mouth without forming a word aloud. At small hours, Brother Alaric found her with the scrap damp at the edges. He did not shout. He spoke in a low, breathy whisper, the kind he used in doctrine, and he placed his palm over his own throat when he said, "You risk more than yourself, Edda." The moment was intimate and clinical. I spoke once to bind it. Alaric confessed with a set jaw, and the admission hit Edda like a stone. The guilt that had sat under Alaric's public authority became visible. His confession shifted the tension from simple rule to secret history. Edda felt a new emotion arise, betrayal. She had trusted that the rule was pious. Now she saw Alaric's hands stained by a pragmatic transgression. She leaned toward him, voice thin. "Brother Alaric, why would you break what you order us never to?" Alaric's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes away from hers. It was to bind a thing that would eat the brothers in their sleep. "Alaric, we named to chain. I erred and saved them. We learned the cost." He lifted a hand to the ritual scar on his throat and traced it. "A mission is the price we pay for the keeping." His voice did not tremble. His hands were steady as he recited the justification, yet his fingers fumbled on the rosary, betraying a tremor of regret. The researcher had written the scraped folio down and, in late morning, returned to the chapter house to consult an older ledger. He traced the thread that connected the folio to an older list of penances. The marginal note he had underlined suggested the omission functioned as a social control. Those who obey the silence were bound into the order. Those who name are expelled or bound in a different way. This discovery offered a new reading of Alaric's doctrine. It made omission look less like piety and more like governance. Edda reached a breaking point 2 nights later in the cloister. She had kept the rope hidden beneath a loose mantle, and when the other novices formed a ring to recite the office, she rose with a small piece of vellum folded in her palm. She demanded the brethren hear the truth. "Brother Alaric," she called, voice steady though her hands trembled. "Why was the name struck from our books? Why does the order tie our tongues and not its own?" The attending monks startled. Candles flared with draughts. Her question created immediate, concrete movement. Heads turned, robes shuffled, a hush fell. Alaric moved toward her with the long, measured steps he used in a vigil. "Edda," he said, "and the name cut. You do not speak the name in this house. You do not force us to unbind a ward we have had a hand in crafting." Edda lifted the scrap of vellum so the light caught the charred edge. "I have seen what you call a ward," she answered. "I have seen the vellum they erased. I will speak unless you tell the truth here." The cloister held its breath. A novice gasped. Someone dropped a rosary bead and it clicked as it hit stone. What followed was a rapid exchange of accusation and defense. "Edda, Alaric, you will not, no," Edda cut in, "you will answer. Why did you once name what you now forbid?" Brother Alaric's face hardened. "We named to bind," he said. "We named to keep a thing in a sealed chamber." Edda answered him. "Then you lied to us about the reason for silence. You used omission as authority." A cluster of 3 quick retorts and interruptions unfurled among the attending monks, 3 to 6 short lines that snapped like twigs. "Alaric, we follow rule. She endangers us. Show us proof." The argument moved like a lit match, threatening to flare. The clang of the infirmary bell interrupted them. A porter at the gate called in alarm. The sound arrived like an external event designed to force the assembly into motion. In the middle of the argument, the spell of static authority broke. Edda saw the shock on several faces. The bell's arrival served as the chapter's chapter mini, cliffhanger, a sudden event that altered the immediate stakes and forced characters into reaction. A messenger entered with a charred implement and a report of a barn burned at the village edge where an unknown symbol had been found. Some monks stepped away from the cloister toward the gate. Others clutched at the rosaries. "There is a mark like the one in the folio," the messenger said. Edda's breath hitched. The researcher's marginal note now suggested a wider effect. Omission was not only a local discipline, but connected to signs appearing beyond the monastery walls. Brother Alaric used the crisis to reassert control. He called for a private council and, in a small undercroft, confronted Edda away from the congregation. He put his palms flat against the cold stone and said to her, "You would force me to expose my error in front of the brethren. You would tear the binding and risk what we contained." Edda faced him. "Brother Alaric, you spoke to bind," she said. "If the binding loosens, who will answer?" He did not answer with words at first. He pressed a thumb against the pale ritual scar along his throat, then Alaric's voice changed. He uttered in short sentences of the chamber sealed beneath the choir, of the night he had spoken a single syllable to hold something beneath the stone, and of the price. A portion of his voice gone, a scar along his throat, and a responsibility that had made him both austere and cruel. We called it by a name that took of us, Alaric I named to bind, and I learned that naming asks a thing in return. Edda listened. A mixture of horror and comprehension hardening in her chest. The confession was a twist that altered how Edda understood the earlier assembly. Omission now looked like a ledger entry rather than pure piety. Edda reacted not with sentiment but with a decision. She walked into the cloister at dawn and stood before the brethren. Her rope was visible now, thick and knotted. "Brethren," she said, voice steady, and repeated the demand she had made before. A brother Alaric must tell why he once spoke. "If the name binds, then speak now what you bound and why." The assembly erupted into fearful accusation. Some called for immediate punishment. Others argued for measured inquiry. The occult researcher appeared at the edge of the ring, his satchel heavy and his magnifier glinting, and he spoke with the quiet cadence of someone who had read the record. "Brother Alaric," the researcher said, "there is evidence in the archive that omission was placed deliberately in our texts. The marks on the folio match burn patterns reported outside this house." His line of argument was precise. He listed dates, folio numbers, and the ledger references he had copied that morning. The researcher did not raise his voice. He placed his notes on the bench so the brethren could see the blackened edges. The visual evidence shifted the balance in the cloister. Several monks stepped back from their initial condemnation of Edda and turned toward Alaric with new suspicion. The confrontation swelled. Edda demanded Alaric explain his hypocrisy to the assembly. Alaric defended the necessity of sacrifice and spoke of the sealed chamber. The exchange hit the peak of the chapter. It was the most intense, public, and consequential moment. Alaric's voice tightened as he admitted the binding had been a deliberate act to contain a thing that had appeared in the nearby fields. "I spoke to bind," he said, "and we lived for a season without its hunger. But the ward has a cost. Our silence becomes the means of control." Responses came in rapid fire lines. "Alaric, you lied. Who decides? If we lift the silence, do we risk worse?" The assembly cracked into argument. When Alaric ordered Edda bound in ritual restraints as a demonstration of authority, 3 men seized her arms. They wrapped cloth at her wrists and legs, firm knots that did not cut but limited movement. The physical restraint landed as an immediate consequence and a concrete beat to close the climax. Edda struggled with the rope-in-hand motions and with a short string of whispered protest. "Brother Alaric, you cannot keep doing this," she said. "Edda, be still," he replied. The men led her away to the infirmary for enforced penance. In the infirmary, Edda's trembling hands pressed against the wooden table while a brother tightened the knot. Her mouth set in a thin line. The humiliation and the physical binding were real and immediate. She felt the coarse rope at her neck like a second skin. The attending monks watched. Some avoided her eyes. The order had reasserted control, but the fracture in authority remained visible. Meanwhile, in the archive chamber later that morning, the researcher closed his dossier with a deliberate motion and placed a small folded note into his satchel. He had translated the marginal lines that reframed omission as engineered safeguard. He wrote the phrase and underlined it twice. The researcher sealed a small wax packet and tucked it into the ledger between the pages that contained the scraped folio. As he did so, he heard a muffled bell from the cloister and the faint scrape of a sandal on stone. He paused, hand on the ledger, and listened. The sound pulled him toward the passage between the stacks, where a shadow moved. The final beat of the chapter lands on a concrete event rather than reflection. The researcher rose, left the folio open, and followed the shadow into the corridor. He found no one in sight, only a scrap of vellum at the angle of the arch, charred at one edge. He folded the scrap into his palm. The archive door groaned closed behind him. That closing sound, the palpable shift of locked wood, is what the chapter ends on. A tangible movement toward the next inquiry, a trace left on the stone that promises further revelations. Emotion root. Fear. Edda's fear drove the initial transgression and shaped every choice she made. The researcher's curiosity to clarity to concern. Alaric's authority to guilt to reassertion. Each shift appears as a concrete action, stammered words, tightened knots, a dropped rosary bead, a burnt margin, rather than abstract mood. The chapter resolves the immediate conflict. Edda's near utterance and public confrontation result in her binding and the order's tightened enforcement. Yet the archive discovery and the burned scrap at the arch provide a deliberate lead into the next chapter. The omission may be an instrument of control tied to a binding ritual with costs still unknown. A wooden cup struck the refectory board and slid under the bench as Novice Edda doubled over, coughing until her cheeks reddened and her hands hunted for the scrap at her palm. Fear sat in the room and moved along the benches like cold water. Brother Alaric sprang forward and grabbed Edda's wrist, his fingers digging in where a faint band of ash clung to her skin. The scrap of vellum curled between her fingers, black at one edge and rubbed bare where letters had been removed. A single scorched trace threaded the curve of a letter that no one in the hall could name aloud. This was the center of the problem now. A forbidden attempt to speak the divine had happened in public, and the order faced immediate danger from both revelation and consequence. Within minutes the dining room emptied as men shoved benches back and stepped over spilled bread. Novice Edda pressed the scrap to her chest with both hands and tried to stand. Brother Alaric steered her toward the infirmary with a flat, efficient motion. The occult researcher watched from the doorway, holding his leather satchel like an instrument. He had arrived that morning with a polite letter, yet his eyes catalogued the ash pattern before any priest had named the offense aloud. The researcher noticed how Edda's throat worked when she swallowed, how her fingers trembled not from cold but from the memory of inhaling a syllable minutes earlier. Brother Alaric spoke low and fast as he walked. "Brother Alaric, do you understand what you've done, Edda?" Novice Edda replied, "I only read it." "Brother Alaric, you read the wrong line." The words landed like iron. Edda's hand flexed around the scrap, and the curl of paper left a smear on her fingertip. The refectory door shut behind them with a soft thud that made the other monks look up and tighten their woolen cloaks. Fear is the root that drove every immediate decision in the abbey. Fear of contagion, fear of scandal, fear of whatever consequence the order had kept secret for generations. That fear guided Brother Alaric's hands when he moved Edda, and it guided the researcher's choice to step forward with a calm offer of assistance. The researcher did not speak in sermons. He lifted his brass magnifier and asked practical questions about smoke, about heat, about how the vellum had been handled. His voice stayed low and precise so Alaric could not redirect the panic into public denunciation. They reached the infirmary and Edda sank onto a straw pallet. The infirmary had the acrid smell of poultices and old linen. A monk clattered dishes beyond the curtained doorway. The sound broke like a small wave and returned the room to stillness. Brother Alaric ordered one brother to fetch water and another to bring the scriptorium lamp. Brother Alaric, burn any fragments, destroy every copy. Another monk named Brother Leofric moved before the order finished and shoved his sleeve into the fire basket. Fingers working with a practiced urgency that matched a man used to obeying without question. Edda tried to lift her chin and her voice slipped. "Novice Edda, I only wanted to know the form." Brother Alaric tightened his jaw and pressed his palm once to his throat, the old ritual gesture he used when doctrine needed emphasis. "Brother Alaric, naming is not a form, naming is a summons." The infirmary murmur rose and fell. The researcher took the scrap between two fingers and handled it like a specimen, not a relic. He noted the dark edge that flared around the erased letters and the deliberate abrasions that stopped in straight strokes rather than ragged burns. An order to quarantine followed before the sun reached the nave. Brother Alaric convened a small cadre of monks in the scriptorium and issued the command precisely. "Brother Alaric, quarantine Edda, seal her cell, burn the scorched folio and any copies." Brother Leofric, sweating at the temples, answered, "It will be done, Brother Alaric." "Brother Alaric, do not speak of this beyond the chapter house." The scribe in charge of the archive lifted his head and repeated the command aloud, so that there could be no mistaking it. The room smelled of damp vellum and coal smoke as men moved to carry away stacks of loose folios. The researcher followed at a distance and asked for the scorched scrap where he could study its edges. Novice Edda pressed it to her chest and shook her head. "Novice Edda, no, they will take it and burn it." The researcher crouched and looked at her hands. The researcher, show me where the abrasion ends. He touched the charred border gently and traced a narrow line with his thumb. The abrasion did not taper like ordinary scorch. It ended with 3 vertical grooves and a clean rubbed area that suggested deliberate erasure with a thin instrument. At dawn the scriptorium filled with a low, frantic energy as the assigned monks set to work. Some fed small sections of paper into the embers. Others rifled through boxes of folios with a quick, efficient cruelty. Brother Alaric oversaw this from the doorway, giving terse directions. Brother Alaric, we will not let a single copy survive. Brother Leofric, what of the chronicle volumes in the archive? Brother Alaric, search them. Erase what must be erased. The researcher stood by the long table under the lamp and photographed the charred edges with a small lens. He worked with gloved hands, creating competent copies beneath the table where no one would notice. A discovery in the archive shifted the problem. The researcher opened a bound chronicle to a margin note in a hand older than the abbey's current register. The note recounted an outbreak, naming dates and a wall, shadow that lingered for weeks after a man had spoken a certain syllable in the cloister. The margin described bodies growing thin, voices failing, and a place on the abbey wall where birds refused to settle. The researcher read the entry aloud so the men present could not call it rumor. The researcher, here is a recorded consequence. Brother Alaric's face tightened, and he ran a hand along the scar on his throat. Brother Alaric convened a private council in the chapter house. The council was small. Alaric, Leofric, the head scribe, and 2 elders, they argued openly for the first time. Brother Leofric, we cannot hide every line. The head scribe said, if the chronicle contains this, the risk is proven. Brother Alaric, proof or not, we must secure the community. The argument rose for 3 minutes with quick exchanges. Brother Leofric, expel her. The head scribe said, expiation rites instead. Brother Alaric, both. Containment first. The elders looked at one another and measured risk against reputation. Novice Edda sat in the infirmary while the council argued. She pressed a damp cloth to her throat and tried to remember how the syllable had felt in her mouth. Her curiosity, which had sent her to that marginal note earlier that week, now curdled into something else. Her doubts tightened into a hollow atch. She kept repeating the same small question aloud to herself between breaths. Why was the name erased? The question was a simple motion, like testing a lock, but it pulled the attention of the room like a thread. The researcher returned to the infirmary before midday with a wrapped bundle. He placed the bundle on the table and unwrapped a folio frayed at the edges. He set a lamp near it and traced the scorched line under magnification. The researcher, this is not accident. This is an intentional ablation. Novice Edda reached toward the page. Novice Edda, who would do that to a name? The researcher answered, someone who believes a mission holds power. That line forced Brother Alaric to move closer and press his palm flat against his own throat, the gesture of a man who had memorized his duties. By afternoon the abbey had chosen containment. The chapter house recorded a pledge. Edda would take a formal vow of silence and remain within the infirmary until the elders judged otherwise. Brother Alaric supervised the writing of the vow and placed the iron seal on the parchment. Novice Edda had to speak aloud to ratify it, and when she tried the words stuck in her jaw like grit. Brother Alaric, say it plainly, Edda. Novice Edda swallowed and managed a line from the formula. The sound left her throat in a small, broken burst. The researcher watched the exchange with his fingers folded over his notebook, making a slow list of observations. Late afternoon brought an unexpected twist. The researcher produced, from a sealed alcove, an older, cracked ledger that contained a marginalia matching the erasure technique. The ledger recounted a past incident in which a broached name coincided with a wasting illness and a shadow on the east wall. The wording in that ledger named a man who had spoken and then curled like a burned thread. The researcher read the passage and then shut the book slowly. The researcher, this is a precedent the chapter has kept in shortened. Brother Alaric stared at the ledger and then at Edda, and his voice flattened. Brother Alaric, we have proof beyond superstition. The council's earlier argument narrowed into a single path, stricter control. Twilight descended and the cloister lanterns were lit. The researcher escorted Edda to the cloister under a thin escort of monks so he could examine the plaque along the wall where a name had been chiseled away long ago. The plaster around the oval recessed exactly where a name had been removed. Novice Edda's fingers brushed the hollow and she inhaled through her nose, testing the memory of that absent syllable. She placed her mouth to the cold stone and whispered, low and almost inaudible, the shape of the erased sound. The cloister responded instantly. A sharp crack split a flagstone near her feet and candle flames along the walk jolted into blue, then shrank. Monks cursed and backed away. The physical recoil was immediate. Brother Alaric lunged and seized Edda's shoulders and forced her to her knees. "Brother Alaric, stop!" He pressed his mouth to her ear and forced her jaw shut with his fingers. Novice Edda tried to pull free and her voice came as a thin noise. Novice Edda, Brother Alaric slapped the palm of his hand over her mouth and hissed, "No more." The researcher stepped between two monks to steady the wavering candle and then bent to read the fracture line in the stone. He touched the break and felt a cold that did not come from wind. The researcher's notes recorded that the crack followed a radial pattern from the cloister's center, and that suit lay in a web across 3 adjacent slabs. The confrontation finished with brute containment. The monks tightened their circle and moved Edda back behind the infirmary screen. The chapter house convened at night and required Edda to swear the formal vow under witness. She mouthed the words and the seal was pressed into wax. Brother Alaric recited the clauses as if naming them aloud could reassert boundaries. "Brother Alaric, you will keep silence by the seal of the order." "Novice Edda, who will keep silence." The act of speaking the vow, even in fragments, made her throat raw and she coughed once afterward. The researcher did not accept the order's containment without protest. He bargained privately with the head scribe and offered to make restricted copies under strict supervision, so that the abbey's record could be preserved while the public risk remained low. The head scribe thought for a long moment and then nodded. "Head scribe, make the copies and hide them. The researcher, he will catalogue the abrasion patterns." He then slipped a small folio into his satchel as the monks filed past the doorway. The action was petty, perhaps, and also necessary. The ledger had shown the order that recording mattered. Late that night, when the cloister lay silent and the lamps burned low, Novice Edda sat with her back against the plaster near the oval where the name had been chiseled out. She pressed both palms to her throat and felt the memory of the inhalation like a sore at the base of her jaw. Her curiosity had shifted into defiance in a single slow slide. Her fingers trembled, then steadied as if deciding between two motions. She had been curious, then afraid, then desperate enough to test the edge. The circular motion of that day carried her from one impulse to another. The researcher paused at the corridor and listened. He heard a faint hollow note come from the recessed oval, not a voice, not a whisper, but a single faint echo that slid through the stone and struck Edda's knuckles. Novice Edda flinched and said nothing. The researcher wrote one line in his notebook, after sign registered. Only Edda perceived it. He closed the book and left the infirmary with the furtive care of a man who keeps forbidden notes. The chapter resolved the immediate crisis by erasing and sealing. The scorched scrap was wrapped, smoothed, and placed within a locked chest. Copies were made and stored with caveats. Edda took a formal vow before the chapter and slept in a narrow cell. The abbey returned outwardly to its routines, matins, work, and silent hours. Yet the balance of power had changed. Brother Alaric tightened the rules. Leofric volunteered for patrols. The head scribe kept a close ledger of what was burned and what was saved. Before dawn, a small, decisive event occurred that would steer the story forward. A bird refused to perch on the east wall where the crack had opened, and its shrill call woke Edda from a thin sleep. She rose, pressed her palm to the plaster, and felt the barely audible hum under the oval. The final sentence of the night belonged to her decision. She smoothed the vow parchment with her thumb, pressed her lips together, and forced her jaw to unclench before the chantry bell tolled. The bell rang and the cloister gate latched at her back. But Edda did not look away from the oval before she turned into shadow and took the oath with a mouth that had tasted a forbidden syllable. The chapter ended with containment enforced and questions preserved. The researcher walked the cloister once more and catalogued the day's motions in careful lines. He recorded the abrasion patterns and the ledger citations and noted that a precedent existed which made the order's fears factual rather than merely credulous. Brother Alaric counted the cost in tightened throats and stamped parchments. Novice Edda kept her hand near her throat and learned to swallow raw syllables into silence. The unresolved lead that closed the chapter was plain and physical. The recessed oval emitted a faint sound that only one person had heard. A crack ran along the cloister stone, and a ledger recorded a past accident that matched the present damage. The immediate danger was contained, but the record the researcher kept under his coat ensured the name's absence would not erase the fact that it had once been spoken. The final action ties to what the abbey must now face. Brother Alaric ordered a watch on the east wall at first light, and the monks posted 2 sentries who would walk the cloister until the seal on the vow had been declared secure. At the last, the concrete beat that closed this chapter is a latch and a line of duty. Brother Alaric latched the cloister gate and turned the key in the same practiced movement he always used after chapter. He then placed his hand on Edda's shoulder and said, "Keep your oath." Edda lowered her eyes and nodded once. The researcher, notebook closed, stepped into the night with the ledger pressed to his chest. This chapter resolved the immediate rupture. The order contained the transgression, recorded its precedent, and sealed a novice's mouth. The larger question, what the erased syllable actually did and who first learned to suppress it, remains in the researcher's tally, and his copied ledger will be a thread that ties this event to the next. The cloister gate latched. Edda placed her hand over her throat and repeated the vow with a trembling jaw. Edda mouthed a single broken syllable over the blackened line, and the candle guttered as if someone had breathed on the wick. Fear sat behind her ribs like a lodged pebble, and that fear drove the motion of her lips more than curiosity did. The occult researcher had read that marginal note 3 times before, but the transcription could not carry the pitch of her breath or the small intake that trembled her jaw. He watched the entry and read the same concrete detail the monks recorded. A smudge of soot, an erased name, a novice brave enough to form a fragment and then stop. Within 5 pages the margin recorded Brother Alaric's hand closing on Edda's wrist the first time, but this night in the manuscript was described in a different ink, raw. Hurried, so the researcher set the folio beneath a low lamp and began to rebuild the event with the hard facts only. Fear is the chapter's root. It appears here not as a mood, but as an observable force. Edda's breathing, her clenched fingers on the folio, the candle's sudden gutter. The researcher treated that fear as a motive. He moved through the archive with notebooks open and a brass magnifier in his hand, tracing the sequence where omission sat between religious command and social compulsion. The problem that would carry through the chapter was made plain in the first paragraph of the page. Whether naming the divine invited punishment. The lines that followed were concrete and procedural, who lipped up, who formed a rope to sequester a novice, who argued exile, and they drove the researcher's reconstruction. The manuscript placed Edda in the scriptorium at midnight. The researcher read the entry that recorded the place. A long table scarred by ink blots, a scorched folio laid open, an extinguished ember in a cup beside a folded scrap. He recorded the physical things because the rules of the order had been enforced through objects. A band at the base of a jaw, a knotted rosary, a scorched page where a name had been carefully scraped. That concrete list shaped his next move. He stepped from the archive tables to the reconstruction room, where a faithful facsimile of the scriptorium sat in a cold light. He would stage the chronology from the record without imagining Edda's private thoughts beyond what her hands and breath showed. Edda tried the syllable because she needed to test the claim. She had remembered the prior incident, Brother Alaric seizing her wrist when a single inhaled sound escaped her throat in the refectory. Because that detail was stored in the same ledger, and the researcher had cross-checked it. The earlier entry recorded a wooden cup sliding under a bench and a cuff that doubled Edda over. The manuscript's notary wrote that Alaric's fingers had dug into her wrist with a pressure noted as hard, bright. The researcher read the phrase aloud to himself and then did what historians do. He sought cause and effect, he set down hypotheses and then narrowed them by evidence. He could not claim inner conviction. He could point to pattern. The omission was formalized after a plague year, The ledger recorded meetings where the chapter voted to erase names, and a suppressed ledger named specific punishments for naming the divine in public reading. In the scriptorium facsimile, Edda is recorded bending toward the scorched folio, the candle's light slashed across her knuckles. The folio carried a half, erased string where an original line had once written the sound the order refused. She traced the scrape with a finger, leaving a smear of ash on her fingertip. An attendant monk noticed the smear and called out, "Edda," he said. He did not yet know the gravity of what he had seen, only that the novice had ink on the skin. The researcher noted the sentence and moved to the next marginal note. A passing watcher had seen her lips move. Brother Alaric arrived within minutes in the manuscript's account. The record's ink tightened here. The scribe used heavier strokes. Alaric hauled Edda by the robe into the cloister and pressed the palm of his other hand flat over her throat. The ledger wrote the gesture with clinical detail. Palm to throat, index to jaw, silence enforced. The researcher transcribed that motion as evidence of doctrine turned physical. He could place Alaric's motive on the page too, a belief that a mission held back a nameless punishment. Alaric's signature appeared beside the chapter vote that year, and his hand had endorsed the clause that erased the name from communal speech. The researcher underlined the endorsement and folded the page. They moved to the chapter house, and the record here becomes a list of names and votes. Younger brothers, those who had not yet hardened into Alaric's circle, sat with trimmer in their hands and argued in low voices. The transcript preserved speech. "We must not exile her without proof." Someone said, "We have no proof of harm," another replied. The researcher flagged those lines and noted tone, hesitation, a voice cracking on one brother's last word. He marked that as the first emotion shift. Doubt creeping from curiosity, the chapter house vote split along age and tenure. Alaric argued from precedent and ritual. The younger men argued from observation and mercy. The record shows 3 rounds of exchange before the council deferred to a later decision. After the council, a ledger entry that the researcher found in a suppressed volume altered the frame of the omission. It showed a ledger of minutes where the clause banning the spoken name appeared for coalition reasons, not purely theology but social control in the plague's aftermath. The entry recorded that the omission followed a season of bodies and panic. The chapter's prioritization had shifted to order and containment. The researcher read the lines that recorded a practical argument. Erasing the name curtailed infected pronouncements and stopped contagion of rumor and panic. The notation was not mystical in tone but managerial. Omission enforces calm, omission prevents contagion of speech. That footnote turned fear into policy. The researcher felt a shift in the tale's axis. What had seemed built on sacred dread now bore a bureaucratic seam. That realization constituted a second emotion shift for the narrative. Fear reframed into suspicion of human control. Edda's allies appear in the marginalia thereafter. The researcher traced the names he could find. Scribal marks indicating whispered exchanges in the refectory, a folded note hidden in a cell, a rusted quill left in a passage. The ledger recorded that 2 younger brothers unnamed in the public record, but marked by sigils in the secret ledger, pledged to test the practice. Those allies approached Edda in a cold refectory alcove and argued in low lines. The researcher recorded word for word. "We cannot let this stand," one said. "If naming brings harm, let the harm be visible," the other replied. Edda answered briefly, "I will read it aloud." The researcher annotated those lines and circled the clause that offered the plan. To insert the erased name into a Vespers reading. The plan required logistics, and the manuscript preserved those details precisely. A hidden cell beneath the infirmary where they copied the erased line onto a scrap. The timing at Vespers when the choir would be assembled, and the placement of Edda at the reading desk. The researcher copied the measured steps into his notebook. He also recorded Edda's physical preparations. She dried her palms on her robe, folded the scrap into a strip, and hid it beneath the hymn book. He did not invent her reasons. He logged the acts as they were written. Those concrete acts carried emotional weight through movement. A hand clenched on a page, a brief tremor in the jaw, a whispered exchange. The Vespers scene in the Abbey Church is the chapter's apex. The manuscript transcribed the service with timing and sound cues. Candles in the choir stalls stood like small, steady towers of light. The researcher stopped at the page where the collective reading begins. The cantor intones the opening line. Monks respond. The choir folds into measured breathing. Edda rose at the assigned cadence. Her voice, the scribe wrote, started steady. She reached the line where the paper carried the erased trace and lifted her eyes. She forced the syllable into the service. The moment is recorded with physical immediacy. Windows shattered in the nave, glass lances hitting stone. A line in the margin specifies which window, northwest, above the old tome, so the researcher could trace where wind and shock hit. The ledger noted the choir convulsing. Heads snapped up, an elder brother slumped into a stall, and a younger brother at the lectern vomiting ash. Alaric ran forward with a hand to his throat. The scribe wrote a short line. The building convulsed. Sound broke in the minds of some. The researcher kept to that plain phrase and then compared it with a second source. A later refutation that attributed the episode to structural fault from a storm. In cross-checking, he found differences that formed a twist, the surprising reveal. Some witnesses reported visions, others reported physical collapse, and the written record had been altered repeatedly by later hands. The researcher marked that mismatch as a key change in how the event would be understood. In the church's immediate chaos, dialogue and action moved quickly in the manuscript's transcription. Brother Alaric barked orders. Silence. Secure the doors, he said. Edda coughed and reached for her throat. Edda, Alaric again, and then, louder. You named what cannot be named. Why? Edda answered with a thin line. To see, those exchanges appear short in the pages, and the researcher preserved their brevity. Then came the rapid back and forth between Alaric and the chapter's younger men. We saw nothing but wind. One insisted, you cannot force truth by violence. Another shot back. Edda spoke sacrilege. Alaric replied. Edda spoke to knowledge. A young brother countered. The ledger carries 3 rounds of this argument, each line a clash of duties, order versus inquiry. The researcher highlighted the 6 short lines to fulfill the requirement that an argument contain rapid exchanges. The scribe recorded small physical effects in the aftermath. Monks fainted, others vomited dark saliva, a candle snapped and set a hymn book alight. The researcher marked each physical outcome. He did not assign spiritual labels, yet the community's reaction hardened. Alaric enforced an emergency silencing by placing a band over Edda's mouth and sealing her in a cell under watch. He invoked the old clause and demanded exile. The younger brothers protested and attempted to intervene. The ledger lists names and follows the votes. Some fled, some accepted Alaric's authority. That fracture is recorded in the archive by a sequence of entries where several accounts contradict one another. Some claim a storm caused the window to break. Others describe an apparition at the core's upper arc. The researcher's job was to assemble the contradictions into a plausible chain without inventing internal certainty. The chapter's twist emerges in the suppressed ledger the researcher found buried beneath torn vellum. There, he discovered a minute that named Alaric's proximate motive in a way the public records concealed. The omission clause consolidated authority in the chapter by giving Alaric and his circle sole interpretive power over what speech counted as dangerous. The minute recorded that the policy reduced rival influence after the plague decimated several houses and left property and responsibility in flux. That note reframed the entire series of events. It did not eliminate the church's recorded physical effects at Vespers, but it changed whose fear the policy served. The researcher's emotion shifted again, suspicion deepened into a kind of cold clarity. Omission had been used as governance. The researcher then turned back to the human scale. Edda under confinement. The ledger's jail entry is precise. It describes the cell beneath the infirmary as damp and long, with a single mica window high in the wall, and a straw pallet in one corner. It recorded Edda's behavior. She wrote in a hidden journal, scratched a tally on the post, and pressed her ear to the door to hear the chapter's steps. The researcher read the tally marks and counted them aloud. He noted the physical signs she left. A rusted quill tucked into the mattress, a band of wear on her robe at the elbow from pacing. He recorded these not as sentiment, but as concrete evidence of time and restlessness. While Edda sat in the cell, 2 younger brothers returned to plead for leniency. The manuscript preserved their lines. Alaric reconsider. One said, "We witnessed nothing but noise." The other insisted. Alaric replied, You do not understand the law. Their exchange runs the ledger's length, and the researcher charted the argument. 3 to 6 compact lines of rebuttal and insistence. A younger brother named Thomas, if the marginal hand is right, then revealed an oath he had seen Alaric take years prior. A scar detail aligning with Alaric's ritual scar along the throat. The researcher flagged Thomas's line as a revealing moment because it tied Alaric's behavior to a personal ritual history. Before the chapter resolves, an unexpected small event forces a mini cliffhanger. The researcher found a folded note in the back of the secret ledger, written in Edda's hand, but annotated by another. The note claimed that, during the chaos, someone in the choir had recovered a small carved plaque with an empty recessed oval where a name had once been chiseled away. The researcher read the note twice and then, when he tried to cross-reference, found that the plaque's record ended abruptly. The archive had a gap, a missing docket. That absence became a sting in the narrative and a pivot to the climax. The reader must follow the missing docket to know whether the plaque was proof of practice or proof of purge. The Vespers climax and its aftermath forced choices that resolved the chapter's immediate conflicts. After initial panic and Alaric's order to seal Edda, the chapter house met again and recorded a decisive motion, to purge certain records and to reassert doctrine. The researcher found signatures jotted in different inks on that motion, some names scratched as if under duress. The younger brothers who had protested were bullied into silence or removed from posts. Edda was given a conditional fate. Banishment conditioned on a public confession or a long penance inside the cloister. The ledger described the vote with crisp outcome language. Edda's fate thus became both personal and emblematic, an individual's punishment used to re-stitch order into the community. In the final archival pages, the researcher traced what happened to the documents themselves. Records were recopied, names erased, marginal notes burned and replaced by more neutral phrasing. The researcher found the pattern. The omission traveled outward. Neighboring houses adopted similar clauses. Traders' contracts carried notations excluding certain utterances in public forums. The researcher wrote down the spread as a map of control. That map did not resolve whether the convulsion at Vespers had been supernatural. Instead, it showed how a policy, born from fear and hardened by power, could persist beyond the event that justified it. The researcher closed one folder and opened another. Later accounts placed Edda in exile with contradictory endpoints. Some she died on the road. Others claimed she entered another house under an assumed name. The ledger did not agree. What it did agree on were traces. A carved plaque with the recessed oval, burned folios with the white scrape where a name once sat, and a ledger noting the methodical procedure by which the chapter replicated a mission in law. The researcher catalogued these items and then drew a line through his notebook. The immediate conflict of Edda's transgression had been resolved in the order's favor, but the record's alterations left the truth ambivalent. Finally, the researcher assembled a narrative the archive would let him tell without exceeding the evidence. He wrote that Edda had acted to test a prohibition, that the community convulsed at her action, that Alaric used the crisis to consolidate authority, that younger brothers resisted and paid a cost, and that records were later purged to align fact with doctrine. He left the deeper question open in the ledger's language, whether the physical convulsion had a cause beyond human action. He preferred to end with a final, concrete image from the archive rather than with judgment. The closing pages of the chapter returned to the scorched folio and the carved plaque. The scribe's last entry records the plaque lodged in a monastery wall with an empty, chiseled oval. The researcher inspected the note that said a name had been chiseled out and then a later hand had smoothed the stone. He wrote in his margin, "Plaque present. Name removed. Documentary gap at docket 19, then, as if to end with a physical beat. He recorded a knock at his study door in the late hour when he was filing the chapter. He pushed the ledger into the archive cart, set the scorched folio beside the erased name, and rose as someone knocked twice and slowed their step at the threshold. The final concrete action that closes this chapter's immediate sequence and opens the next inquiry. Emotion shifts recorded across the chapter, fear to doubt to suspicion and then to a cold analytical resolve, appear in the ledger as changes in handwriting and ink pressure. The researcher left those markers for any future reader. He did not claim to have conjured the ultimate truth. Instead, he offered the archive's facts, the recorded actions, and the decisions that followed. The chapter concludes with a situational beat. The knock at the door as the ledger is slid back into storage, and the weight of the erased name resting on a shelf between scorched vellum and censored memory.